I keep feeling like I should be waking up from a dream right now, and it's just not happening. So yeah, it's like a movie or something. It's not supposed to be real life.
In early November of 2015, an emotional young South Carolina woman named Amy Vilardi gave interviews to a number of state and local television stations. As viewers inched towards the edge of their seats, Amy recounted how she discovered the bodies of her mother and 3 other family members who had been brutally murdered just a few days before.
I went to knock on the door, and I walked in. It was dark. I heard TVs on, and I flipped the light on, and that's about as far as I can go on that one.
She was joined by her husband, Ross Vilardi, for many of the interviews, but unlike her, he was relatively stoic and emotionless. She thanked her friends, family, and the community for their prayers and support and described her deceased relatives as wonderful people. She also said that she and her husband had nothing to do with the murders and that she couldn't understand how the guilty party or parties lived with themselves. Ironically, these statements would come back to haunt her nearly a decade later. Before we begin, we would like to extend our sincere condolences to the family and friends of the victims in this case, who were taken from this life brutally and far too soon. The residents of Anderson County, South Carolina have always prided themselves on their civic spirit and the small-town charm which their communities are well known for. Located on the eastern edge of the Bible Belt, it's no surprise that many South Carolinians take things like religion, patriotism, and family bonds seriously. Even so, Anderson County has always had its fair share of crime. They run the gamut from drug and domestic violence offenses to vandalism, theft, and even murder. However, the shocking quadruple homicide that took the lives of 4 of Amy's family members was unlike anything anyone had seen. Almost overnight, the otherwise carefree and trusting residents of the northwest South Carolina town became more guarded and suspicious than they had ever been before. This was particularly true of Amy's surviving family members because at that point, they couldn't help but wonder if the killer or killers would come after them next. By early November 2015, Amy and Ross Vilardi had only been married for about a week. After their picture-perfect wedding in Columbia, South Carolina, the newlyweds moved to a trailer on Refuge Road in the small town of Pendleton. Amy's 60-year-old mother, Kathy Scott, Kathy's 59-year-old husband, Mike Scott, Mike's 80-year-old mother, Barbara, and Amy's 82-year-old grandmother, Violet Taylor, lived together in a trailer on the same property. According to Amy, she saw her mother briefly on Halloween night at approximately 8 p.m. The following morning, November 1st, she and Ross got up early and drove to Blythewood, South Carolina, to pick up her 2 children from a previous relationship who had stayed with Ross's parents that weekend. They spent most of the day with the Ross family, and that evening, Ross, Amy, and the kids drove back to Pendleton and spent a quiet night together. Neither she nor anyone else spoke with any of her family members who lived in the other trailer that night. The next morning, November the 2nd, Amy says she became mildly concerned when she didn't see her mother taking her dogs for a walk in the morning like they usually did. But at this point, she wasn't too concerned because her elderly mother lived with 3 other family members who looked after her. If something was wrong, Amy felt sure she would have heard about it, but picked up the phone and called her mother's trailer just to be on the safe side. Nobody answered the call, but Amy claims to have left a message on the answering machine. She figured she would hear back from somebody in a matter of minutes, but since no one returned the call, she walked over and knocked on the back door. She found it odd that the door was partially open, and when no one showed up to let her in, she had a sinking suspicion that something just was not right. After all, it was already mid-morning, and at least one of the trailer's residents would have heard her knock. After a brief moment of indecision, Amy pushed the door open and walked in, but the trailer was nearly pitch black because all of the curtains were drawn. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness slowly, and as they did, she thought she could make out a number of dark shapes on the floor that seemed out of place. A few seconds later, when she flipped on the lights, she was greeted by a scene of unimaginable horror.
The victims suffered gunshot wounds, as well as multiple stab wounds and lacerations.
The mangled and blood-soaked bodies of her grandmother Violet, her stepfather Mike, and Mike's mother Barbara were strewn awkwardly on the living room floor. Amy's mother wasn't among them, but she discovered her bloody and lifeless body in a bedroom less than a minute later. It was difficult to tell exactly what had happened in the trailer, but it looked like each of the victims may have been shot, perhaps beaten, and stabbed as well. According to Amy, she could not detect a pulse when she placed her fingers on their wrists. Sadly, they were all dead. Amy was understandably in shock, but she did have the presence of mind to call 911 from the phone in the trailer around 12:30 p.m. The operator told her that deputies were on the way and instructed her to wait outside until they arrived. According to Amy, her husband Ross arrived at the trailer a few minutes later. The deputies and investigators who responded to Amy's call were confronted with a horrific spectacle. In fact, they had never seen anything remotely like it in Anderson County. They detected no signs of forced entry, and it didn't look like a robbery because there was a number of valuable items left in plain sight. They were pretty sure they were dealing with 4 homicides, but had to consider alternative scenarios like a murder-suicide as well. However, this theory was quickly ruled out when they looked at the bodies a bit more closely. Each of the victims had multiple wounds, and they had all been stabbed and shot. Mike Scott, Barbara Scott, and Violet Taylor's throats were all slit, and they were probably all dead before the killer or killers shot them. But unfortunately, this does not seem to have been the case for Amy's mother, Kathy. Instead, the stab wound to the chest probably didn't kill her, which meant she was still alive when she was shot. They knew that in particularly brutal homicide cases like this one, the perpetrators were usually friends, family members, or close acquaintances of the victims. In other words, it was unlikely that they were dealing with a random crime, and there was a good chance that the killer or killers knew the victims and harbored some animosity towards them. As such, investigators considered Ross and Amy prime suspects from the very beginning. After all, nobody was closer to the victims than they were. The motive was still a mystery, but they knew it could have been something as mundane as a petty dispute over money or a silly family argument that had snowballed over the years. Whatever the case, Anderson County deputies seized 18 firearms, 2 vehicles, and $87,000 in cash from a gun safe in the initial search of the Vilardi's trailer. Interestingly, the money was meticulously wrapped and organized by denomination and year.
Approximately $87,000 in cash was found in the single-wide trailer belonging to Amy Vilardi. There was a gun safe in the trailer. The cash was wrapped. The bills were wrapped and separated in denominations by year. It's a very specific way of organizing the money. And what was significant about that was the way that the victim, Terry Michael Scott, organized the money in his house.
After a little digging, investigators discovered that Mike Scott had a side business, buying and selling gold, and that he kept large amounts of cash on hand. Family members told investigators that he organized and wrapped his bills by year and denomination, just like the money that was found in the gun safe. Even so, Amy denied that the money had ever belonged to him. She said that she and Ross had saved it themselves over the previous few years, but they couldn't provide any proof to substantiate this claim. Investigators didn't believe Amy's story, and a closer examination of the Vilardi's financial records revealed that it would have been nearly impossible for them to have saved such a large amount of money on their own. They owned a dog grooming business that had been in the red for quite some time. In addition, their personal vehicles were dangerously close to being repossessed, and they were about to be evicted from the space they rented for their business. In fact, things had gotten so bad that Ross wrote a post-dated $8,000 check to the landlord on the promise that there would be sufficient funds in the account to cash it on November the 2nd. As far as investigators could tell, the Vilardi's only other source of income was a modest pension that Ross received from the Marine Corps. However, Amy received an undisclosed inheritance after the murders, and she and Ross began paying off some of their more pressing debts on the very day she discovered the bodies. After becoming executor of her mother's $140,000 estate, Amy promptly drew the balance down to less than $1,000, but investigators couldn't figure out where most of the money went. The quadruple homicides were still far from solved, but the Vilardis' bleak financial situation and the money found in the trailer were suspicious, to say the least. Another red flag was that investigators never found any message Amy claimed to have left on her mother's answering machine.
Amy reported that before going over to check on her mother, she had called the home phone and left a message yelling for them to pick up the phone. As I stated earlier, that message was never found.
Later, investigators interviewed friends and family members of the deceased and found out that they didn't get along with Amy and Ross. At one point, Amy had apparently forbidden her children from visiting their grandmother.
After further investigation and a multitude of witnesses, it was revealed that Amy Vilardi and the victims did not get along. It had gotten to the point where Amy had refused to allow them to interact with her children.
After the autopsies, the coroner determined that the victims could have been dead anywhere from a few hours to more than a day before their bodies were discovered. This meant they probably died on October the 31st or November the 1st. Ballistics tests revealed that the bullets taken from the victims' bodies all came from the same gun. They weren't fired from any weapon taken from the Vilardis' trailer, however. As months and ultimately years passed by, much of the public lost interest in the case and assumed it had gone hopelessly cold. Meanwhile, Amy and Ross slipped back into their normal lives as if nothing had happened. But that wasn't the case for the victims' other family members. They struggled to come to terms with the tragedy and tried to stay positive when it seemed like the killers may never be brought to justice. Investigators remained tight-lipped, but did continue working the case. But at that point, it wasn't clear if anyone would ever be charged with the murders. Then, in 2016, the Vilardis filed a lawsuit to force the Anderson County Sheriff's Office to return the cash, firearms, and vehicles that had been seized immediately after the murders. According to the Vilardis' attorney, investigators went over the items with a fine-tooth comb, but failed to turn up any evidence linking them to the killings. Nonetheless, the judge ruled that the items did not have to be returned. Then, later that year, the case got a much-needed shot in the arm when Chris McBride was sworn in as the new Anderson County Sheriff. He and a few investigators who had worked on the case early on began looking at it with a renewed sense of hope. Sheriff McBride's team also made sure to get plenty of media attention because they thought there still might be someone out there with important information who had yet to come forward. They knew the wheels of justice often turned slowly, but they felt confident that the perpetrators would eventually be hauled into court to answer for their crimes. More than 8 years after the killings, in December of 2023, they were arrested by deputies at their home in Columbia, South Carolina. They were transported by the Anderson County Sheriff's Office back to Anderson County and charged with 4 counts of murder each. Later, they were booked into the Anderson County Detention Center. During a post-arrest press conference, Sheriff McBride reiterated that the Vilardis had always been persons of interest and that he was optimistic that someday they would be arrested and prosecuted for the murders.
Sheriff tells us that they've suspected the Vilardis for several years, but he cannot provide any further details on that evidence they have against them or possible motive. He said that would all be coming out in court.
He went on to describe the murders as senseless and brutal, but he declined to disclose a motive or to say what new evidence had led to the arrests. Those present at the press conference were disappointed that more information wasn't revealed, but Sheriff McBride assured them that it was important not to give the defense anything more than was legally required. The Vilardis' first day in court came at their preliminary bond hearing on December the 16th of 2023, after which they were ordered back to their jail cells. However, their attorneys scheduled another bond hearing for February 14th of 2024. During that hearing, prosecutor Heather Weiss from the South Carolina Attorney General's office informed the court that 2 shanks, or homemade prison knives, had been found in Amy's cell the previous day. In response, defense attorney Lori Murray pointed out that Amy kept her belongings on an unused bunk and that she shared the cell with 2 other inmates, and it was impossible to determine who made the shanks or who they may have belonged to.
The shank or whatever the weapon that was found in the cell, first of all. I've talked to my client, gotten her side of this. She was in a cell with 2 other people. There were 4 bunk beds in there. Ms. Vilardi kept her belongings on top of a bunk bed that wasn't in use. This shank, knife, whatever it was found in a drawer. They said it was her drawer, but the belongings were in that drawer.
As in the first bond hearing, the prosecutor asserted that Amy had masterminded the brutal murders and that both she and Ross were flight risks. Attorneys are generally restricted to addressing bond-related issues during these types of hearings. But in this instance, Prosecutor Weiss made motive a central point as well. She reminded the court that Amy and Ross's dog grooming business had been in dire financial straits in the months leading up to the murders. In addition, $87,000 in cash was found in their trailer, wrapped and organized like Mike Scott's money, and some of the serial numbers matched bills that had once belonged to him. Then, on the day the bodies were discovered, the Vilardis miraculously had enough cash to make most or all of their financial problems go away. It could not have been any clearer. Amy and Ross were the only people who benefited from those 4 deaths. The prosecutor also argued that Ross's experience as a Marine may have explained why the murders were carried out with such brutal efficiency. After all, Ross was trained in hand-to-hand combat during his time as a Marine, and according to the prosecutor, he kept the K-bar knife that he was issued when he was discharged. Ross's defense attorney, Sean Kent, countered that it was wrong to use Ross's service to his country against him, and that hand-to-hand combat training was mandatory for all Marines. It's also worth mentioning that there doesn't seem to be any proof that the K-bar knife was used to stab the victims or slit their throats. The second bond hearing was also the first time that many of the victims' family members were able to have their voices heard. Barbara Scott's daughter, Pam, told the court how her life and the lives of their family members were permanently changed by the heinous crimes. She added that even after all these years, there were still so many questions that hadn't been answered. Violet Taylor's granddaughter, Tammy, also told the court that she and her family spent much of the previous 8 years in fear because they weren't sure if the killer or killers would come after them as well. Later, Sheriff McBride agreed with the witnesses and the prosecutor that the Vilardis should remain in custody. Despite the overwhelming sentiment that bond should be denied, defense attorney Murray argued that the Vilardis weren't flight risks. According to her, they had 8 years to flee, but that they had remained in South Carolina even though they could have moved to another state or a foreign country that did not have an extradition agreement with the United States. She argued that this alone proved they would not flee if released on bond. Ross's defense attorney, Sean Kent, accused the prosecution of putting together a questionable case that was light on facts and full of unsubstantiated theories. He said that as far as he could tell, the state spent 8 years developing a far-fetched theory, but was never able to come up with any evidence to support it. Of course, this heated banter is common in bond hearings as well as trials, and only time will tell if the prosecution has additional evidence that it's currently hiding up its sleeve. The Vilardis were denied bond in their most recent hearing, and other hearings are approaching as they remain in jail. Of course, there is a chance that there won't be a trial and the Vilardis will eventually be released, but that seems unlikely. Whatever happens, Barbara Scott's daughter Pam may have summed it up best when she said there are still lots of questions that haven't been answered. Thankfully, many of them may be answered in the next few months. As always, we encourage you to join the discussion by leaving your comments below. Meanwhile, we will continue to keep our eye on things, and we will get you a follow-up video when there is new information available. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like the video. Comment down below your take on it, and please subscribe to the channel. Also, hit the notification bell in order to stay up to date each time we reveal a new shocking case. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes peeled. You never know what's lurking in the shadows.